How do we know God is real with so many people telling us otherwise?
Well, that's it's question. It's got a couple different parts of it. One of it is a question of authority, like what is the source of authority in your life? So, in other words, why do you believe what you believe? What do you base it on? And a lot of people say one thing, but don't necessarily follow through. For a lot of people, it's a mixture and all. So if your authority is what other people say, you know what? If other people say there's no God, then must not be a God, because that's your source of authority. If your source of authority is something else or someone else, for instance, if it's God's Word, it's the Bible itself, well, that's what you're going to find. But God doesn't just give us a Bible and say, believe it, no matter though it go against everything that you know, believe it anyways. God also gives us experience with Him. And so part of it is to know God's Word, and as you live God's Word, to see, in your experience, does it match up with what God's Word says? But notice that's two different things. You're knowing God's Word and then living God's Word. Some people think they're living God's Word, but they don't really know it. And so then when things don't work out, like maybe they pray that God will get them a new job, or God will do some, bless them with a, beautiful spouse or a handsome spouse or whatever. Phil, well, it came true for you, Phil, but not for your wife. But if that's what you believe the Bible teaches, then the Bible's not wrong. You're wrong. You're not understanding the Bible correctly. That's not what God is. God isn't some, wish or genie or, something like that who just gives you whatever you want. And so authority is both understanding God's Word, living God's Word, and seeing that God's Word is consistent. If that's how we know truth. Unfortunately, again, people don't do one or both of those things. They either don't spend the time to know God's Word, or they don't spend the time to actually live it.
Yeah, that's good. You have anything to add, or?
Yeah, well, I agree with Pastor Matt that there's a lot of components to the question, and when I looked at that question, I was kind of trying to break it down for the heart of the question itself, the heart of the issue. And I think this might be a junior high school student who is gone to church their whole life, know all the Bible stories. Now that they're taking science courses, now that they're in school, maybe they're a university student, they're getting a lot of other things, right? So I think the heart of the question might be, and you can always tell me if I'm wrong, that it seems like it's a God versus science question. Maybe that's what the person means. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But when you break it down between God and science, I think there has to be a couple of misconceptions that we have to get out there. The first being that religion or God, believing in God is just believing in myths or fairy tales, and believing in science is evidence-based, fact-based. But that's not necessarily the case. With science, you're still gathering evidence, you're still looking at data, but to call it a fact, you have to make a leap of faith. You have to believe the sources. You have to take that next step for faith. And that's similar with religion. So regardless of whether you believe in God or whether you believe in whatever else someone else is telling you, there has to be a leap of faith made in order for that belief to be true for you. So I think there's a common misconception that science is this, it's fact, and religion is myth. But both take faith.
Yeah, and there's another thing that happens too, where we tend to think like the majority view must be correct. I remember when I lived in Hawaii, and before, when I was growing up here, I would hear all these other views, and the only voice that was giving the opposite view would be like maybe the pastor. Maybe if I went to youth camp, somebody there would say it. And so it just seemed like everybody else had this other view. And it wasn't until, I was older, I got out of college, I went to seminary, and I started to hear there's a lot of other voices out there. There's a lot of other arguments and presentations, very deep intellectual presentations for that don't necessarily push science on the side, but say that any scientific conclusion that says there is no God is not valid. That there's so many other arguments that are for the existence of God that you just don't hear. You're not going to hear it in your school, especially if you go to public school. You're not going to certainly hear it when you get into social media and things like that. And so that's another thing too, that there's a whole field in Christian studies called apologetics. And apologetics is exactly that. It's trying to take a deep, thorough understanding of truth in God's Word and how we know what we know and how we can defend our faiths. And by the way, apologetics isn't something just for old people. Anyone can do it. As a matter of fact, I'd really encourage you that if you get opportunities to study those kind of things, that you would do it, no matter what age you are.
So I guess one question that I would kind of tack onto that and could be helpful for our young people that are watching, is there a book or two that you would recommend that could help strengthen someone who is struggling within this realm of like, oh, how do I know if God is real, besides reading the Bible?
Well, it kind of depends on the person, like where they are.
Maybe for just like a beginner level.
Beginner level. Trying to pull one out of my head here. We had I always say his name wrong. We had J. Warner Wallace come here, and we have an apologetics conference every year, and he came and spoke, and he's a former homicide detective, actually from Los Angeles, and so he applied the same investigatory kind of methodology that they use for homicides. He applied it to examining the truth claims of the Bible, and he wrote books on it, and he's written books that are more geared towards high school teenagers. So that would be one. I can't remember his
Cold Case Christianity.
Yeah, his big book is called Cold Case Christianity, but I can't remember what the one is called. But if you look up his website, you'll see there's one for teenagers, and that may be a good place to start.
J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity. You have one?
Well, I'm thinking about maybe for the junior high level, because they're just coming right out of Sunday school, and all they're given is stories in Sunday school, which is fine. They have to know the stories. But I remember when I was maybe an 8th grader, I read The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip Yancey, old book. It's kind of dated now, but...
Wait, how old are you?
I'm 40. I'm 40 years old. Can't believe it. But I remember reading that book and thinking, wow, Jesus is more than just Sunday school stories. And that got me, like a thread that you pull.
Yeah.
You pull the thread, and I wanted to find out a little bit more.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you started there, and then it eventually led to you.
And then the high school level, I just remember like Mere Christianity. That's something that high school, college level, they can kind of understand a little bit more outside of a religious bubble.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
The other thing you can do too, and you should do, is you should ask. Like, if you're going to church, ask your pastor, ask your youth pastor, and don't be satisfied with weak answers. Challenge your pastor, challenge your youth pastor to give you, good answers. Don't just accept that, believe it because you're supposed to believe it, kind of a thing, or some kind of, science is being done by all these Satanists that are plotting against the overthrow of Christianity. Don't accept those arguments, and because if nothing else, it'll make your pastor better. It'll make your youth pastor better, because you're telling them what you're hearing, and you're not the only one hearing it. And that's gonna, if you have a good pastor, you have a good youth pastor, and they don't have an answer, it's gonna drive them to go and want to know more and study more.
Yeah. Me and Phil, we work in Korean settings, and I know a lot of times we don't want to challenge a pastor's authority. That's kind of ingrained in our culture. But go ahead, youth, challenge me, right?
Yeah.
Challenge us.
I
appreciate that a lot.
Is
Yeah.
one of the ways to
Lets
do
us
that.
know you're listening too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good.